You're listening to The Partially Examined Life, a podcast by some guys who at one point set on doing philosophy for a living, but then thought better of it. Our question for episode 375 is, what impact, if any, should sexual difference have on philosophy and society? We read several selections published between 1977 and 1993 by Luce Irigaray, as presented in Chapter 7 of the year 2000 edition of the Rowman and Littlefield French Feminism Reader, edited by Kelly Oliver, with an introduction written by today's guests. For more information about the text in the podcast, please see partiallyexaminedlife.com. This is Mark Linsenmeyer, reducing the rising tide of abstraction through concrete, sacrificial goals in Madison, Wisconsin.
This is Seth Paskin, struggling to find pleasure in the phallic economy in Austin, Texas.
This is Dylan Casey, engaging in the economy of desire in Madison, Wisconsin.
And our special guest.
This is Jenny Hansen, trying to find some space for a voice in the fallow, logocentric economy. Well,
I'm glad that I could cue you when to talk. I'll make sure to tell you every second of this discussion when you're allowed to talk, when I'll cut your mic. We don't do that. Thanks for coming back, Jenny. Wes was going to take a vacation. I wanted to pick something that he didn't care that much about. So he doesn't, it's not like he flees when he hears about this kind of topic. It's just that now, when he is going to be fleeing anyway, we pick this kind of topic. And we're always happy to have you back. Folks would remember Jenny from you were on one of the abortion discussions, and you were on one of the Beauvoir discussions, and you were on Philosophy vs. Improv twice.
And Butler.
Oh, Judith Butler. That's right.
Yeah.
Yes. So we've had lots of history with you. Yeah. And you picked this reader. I mean, I had asked about Irigaray because I think you had brought her up last time as somebody we should definitely get to, and we had not gotten to yet. So I didn't know anything about. Seth, had you read any of her?
Yeah.
Okay. So Seth, she's Heideggerian just as much as she's Lacanian. But yeah, Jenny, give us the little intro. Tell the audience why they should care about this. What's going on here?
Oh, well, I think because she spends a lot of her time demonstrating the ways in which philosophy as a discipline depends upon a fundamental matricide, right? That the philosophy as is structured as a discipline, and the methods and the norms and the, tools that it uses all require the repression of women as beings in the world, I guess, if we're using Heideggerian language, as subjects. And that seems like a pretty weighty endeavor. And I will add this, it is often challenging to read Irigaray, but if you stop worrying about reading her in a way that is trying to pull out the arguments, but kind of allow what she's doing to affect your own imagination, it's inspiring. And it was inspiring to me as a graduate student, even though I don't work on it anymore. There were kind of things going on in her text that I really had to think about, and gave me more speculative ideas, I guess, than critical ideas that I appreciated.
Yeah, poetic is a good word. And it's good that we had a selection. This is like really 4 different works. A couple things from The Sex Which Is Not One, 1977. A chunk from An Ethics of Sexual Difference, 1984, which is sort of more concrete, and you could apply this socially. Sexes and genealogies, each sex must have its own rights, yet more, like actually like suggesting some things about the legal system. And then Body Against Body in Relation to the Mother, 1990, those last two are 1993, which is a speech to a psychoanalytic organization. Very much, let's talk about ancient Greek literature. Let's talk. The fundamental matricide is from that formulation of it. She doesn't put it quite that way in the other essay. So we get a little bit of stylistic variation. Yeah. What did I know? I was talking to Dylan beforehand, and he was a little maybe put off by the style.
Okay, Mark. Thank you.
I'm just.
You wouldn't be the only one.
You can. Did I misunderstand?
No, you understood. So she, in ways that I like, in ways that I find myself routinely frustrated by, reminds me a lot of French postmodernism and French, Marxian philosophy and stuff like that. And, on that spectrum, I find someone like Lacan basically insufferable. I mean, I was recounting to Mark, remembering that he is, I think, the only author for whom while we read a selection of his work, we just gave up and read Brian Something's summary of him. It's the first time I've ever done that. And not to put too fine a point on it, there was nothing about what I read of his that made me want to read him. So he is like on the far end. And then on the other end is someone like Foucault, who I found really super digestible. And I read a lot of him. And then there's Derrida, who falls, significantly closer to Lacan, but not full Lacan. And she falls somewhere probably to the Foucault side of Derrida for me. And so there is this poetic aspect to it where I really liked your formulation, Jenny, that you need to listen to the words and the presentation of what she's saying and not presume that she's going to be making an argument in a typical way that you're used to making an argument. And she's not the only one, and the French postmodernists aren't the only ones that do this. But you reminded me of that. Her work is like that. And, there's a whole group of people whose work's like that. And you have to remind yourself to read it that way.
And I would qualify this by saying, we read several essays. And even within the essays, there's quite a bit of variation. If you hadn't told me that she had written Women on the Market, it could have been, by any, well, let's call it contemporary, but post-19 whatever feminist. And I would have been like, okay, it's a pretty straightforward Marxist analysis, right, of women as commodities. That one's, and I came away from that and I was super excited because I was like, oh, because my memory is similar to yours, Dylan, of, trying to struggle. But ultimately, yeah, that one grabbed me the most for sure. And I'm excited to talk about that. But the other thing is I'm sure one of them there was some adaptation from an interview, and I'm sure Jenny, you and Kelly picked these because they're not at the extreme end of stylistically what, you want to introduce. It's called the Feminist Reader, not the Feminist Decipherer or cryptographic text or something like that. So,
yeah. The one other sort of just reaction that and this goes to the analysis question and makes me think about wanting some more analysis in it, is a little bit of struggle, honestly, with recognizing myself and the world that I interact with while recognizing what she's talking about and recognizing what she's portraying or thinking about, recognizing that, not seeing other things that I recognize in what she's pointing at with respect to my masculinity, respect to other women, and my interactions with my children and my interactions with my colleagues. And part of that might be the sort of, she really, especially in the first one, really grabs hold of that sort of polemical feel that Marxist stuff has. And so that might be part of it. And, it's helpful to have like the sort of the practical, pragmatic stuff. But I found myself thinking, how much is this just me? And I'm like in this, I don't get it kind of thing, or am I? So I was just as a general reaction, I was finding myself having to think about that in a way, which is probably good, but I was having to have voice inside my head of, okay, you need to pay attention, and not that was in the context of something like, question marks. I had lots of question marks.
So yeah, let's get concrete about what you're reacting to, because it really wildly varies between very practical advice, like if sexual relationships, if marriages, if relationships are not based on equality, then you're not going to get that Hegelian thing of recognition of yourself through the other, because the other, the woman, is not being treated as a subject. So that's, using something very abstract to get at something very real. And yeah, wouldn't you want to have sex where the woman is not just sort of performing what she's been told that she has to perform, but is actually into it and like in touch with her own desires, and you're communicating with each other. Like that's a real concrete thing. But then that's quite different than other places of like, our entire society and the history of philosophy is based on matricide, is based on the subjugation and commodification of women. And look how this works in Plato. Look at, there's a lot of the references to her initial, or her second dissertation, I guess, a speculum of the other woman, which I guess goes through the whole history of philosophy. So what we read is just sort of hand wavy about this kind of stuff. Just there's one part where she specifically gets into a section of Hegel's phenomenology, which we never read on this podcast, that section of Hegel's phenomenology. I tried to go decipher those couple of pages, but it was hard. It's always hard with Hegel to do something in the abstract, but it's not the master slave part. She refers to that, but it's apparently later in the book, he actually discusses kind of the fundamental point that Aristotle starts with in his Politics, where the family as the fundamental political unit that then is going to expand. And like, well, is the family really this indissoluble unitary thing that has no relations within it? Because it's really just the boss, the man, and they even are explicit, Aristotle, like it's his whole household. It's the servants, it's the cattle. It's like, so there's not leaving anything in there for like a fundamental political relationship between members of the family, or at least not stress, only maybe a sort of master and servant one, such that then, the family is then the servant of the wider state. Yeah. So there's some stuff that relates to literature that we've actually read, but it seems to me a little bit of a separate task to, okay, is this a good analysis of Antigone? Is this a good analysis of the Oresteia, these ancient Greek things, or Hegel, or this very detailed thing? It's really good that we did Marx on commodities, 8 months ago, that it's in our recent past, because one of the readings, this Women on the Market, is going through that chapter exactly and telling you, here's what Marx says, here's how I want to tweak it so that this is what I say. Yeah. So there's a lot for us to get through. Jenny, any other initial?
Well, I guess I have two things that popped into my head while you guys were talking about on the one hand, like, is some of this, a little bit too polemical or too over the top? And then, some of the other stuff about how good of a reading it is. Two things. One was recently when you were just talking about the Hegel section, it made me think about our current political moment where Pete Hegseth, whatever you call it now, retweeted at least one of his congregations, and this idea again of reasserting a kind of patriarchy where the man is the voice of the family and that everything serves the man. And another thing that I was thinking about, the way she writes. And so like the way she'll get into a text like Hegel or Aristotle or Plato or Lacan, it's referred to as mimicry or mimetic, her method. And a side note to connect it to the Butler's notion of performativity, gender's performance, was directly influenced by this method. But I was thinking, like, how can I connect it to this moment? And I think, think about maybe you agree, don't agree, but the sort of rhetorical sort of brilliance of Gavin Newsom's team right now that is going on and actually mimicking Trump's style of describing his policies or his greatness or what he's going to do. And I think that's a way to kind of unlock what she's doing. Everyone who's tried to make an argument in the sort of classical sense with evidence and, pointing out misinformation, disinformation, right? Anyone who's trying to sort of approach this in a way that like we all agree to the rules of the game, it's not working, right? Whereas I think Newsom's team is onto something, because if you don't like his posts, then you have to also not like Trump's posts, right? I mean, he's literally imitating his style. So I think, those are just things that kind of popped in my head. I was reading it now, even though there might be some datedness to some of this. On the other hand, we're seeing kind of a resurgence of some of the ideas of, kind of returning to a strong patriarchal society. And we're dealing with people that don't feel like they need to check other, provide arguments or evidence or provide counter arguments. And if you try to do the frontal assault, show that their argument's bad, it doesn't work. So she's given us a strategy for pointing out what's going on there in some of that discourse.
Let's start in on this questions section in The Sex Which Is Not One. So it's again, a book from 1977. Our second selection, The Women on the Market, is also from that same book. But we read a series of do we think these are actual questions and her answers that were posed to her when she was being examined by, I forget what the body was, it says, or is this sort of her recreation in literature? Like, is this a recording of do we know, Jenny, is this sort of a recording of an interview? I think it's
actually, because she has several books where there's interviews like this. I think it was probably an exchange that got then transcribed.
At her thesis defense, I took it as her thesis defense, right? For her second PhD. That's what I took it as.
I don't know. I should have looked that up, but I just know from reading a lot of her work, especially the work that's more that's easier to grasp. She often has these kind of interviews because she's been like at a political event and people in the audience have asked questions. But this, you might be right. That's kind of an interesting.
Speculum was published as a book in 74, and this is 77.
Yeah, and that would have been, and most of Speculum is not like this. It's much, well, maybe closer to like the women on the market. So
the first note, which I'd have to, let me double check where it is, but the first note says, these three questions were raised explicitly or implicitly by members of the jury during a doctoral thesis defense in the philosophy department of University of Vincennes.
That makes sense. Okay. Yes.
Yeah. So the first one, why does she think I am a sexualized female? She thinks is impossible to say in our language. So this is one of those kind of things, right? We had a feminist philosophy of science episode, like, oh, the fact that science has been male dominated controls the metaphors. It controls the language. And so in philosophy, and even just being a female subject, which is, being a subject has been the foundation of philosophy, at least since Descartes, doing phenomenology. She sometimes thinks that is self-contradictory, as stated, that if you are stating, you're either like Descartes, I am just a thinking thing, or maybe you're adding, I am sexualized, but that invariably means male historically. And I'm not sure, like, even if it's, and I don't want to sort of just get her and you, Jenny, defensive about this immediately. But like, yes, even if that was, most philosophers that you read who are doing phenomenology are coming from that. I don't know why this would preclude different people. That's heterophenomenology. People report on different things they experience. We don't expect, I guess that's sort of built into Husserl's idea that like everybody's experience of fundamental things, of essences, it is going to be the same. But she seems to be in this part gesturing at something like, well, because it's been male dominated, that's why we have like an object-oriented ontology. This is why we think about things instead of processes. And so if we just would open ourselves to real heterophenomenology, to a female point of view, to other points of view that have been silenced in the past, then we would have a whole different take on philosophy. We would have a whole different metaphysics, a whole different way of relating to God, etc.
So this first part, I don't know if you wanted me to definitely be the first one to respond to it, but this part I think is helpful. Well, to me, it was extremely helpful as a graduate student in the 90s, and there were not a lot of women in philosophy. And I think at one of my graduate programs, there wasn't even a single tenured woman. And so that's just a little bit of a context, right? Like it actually took me by surprise to realize that when philosophers were speaking, as I, or even just individuals saying I, that it was the generic male, that it's not, we don't think of it that way, but essentially it is sort of a gendered I implicitly. And that helped me a lot too. I did my dissertation on philosophy of psychiatry and thinking ahead to the last one where she's like talking at two clinicians about hysteria and none of the men are coming, right? Like, I think I understood the ways in which there's assumptions made about your identity that you're male unless someone sees you. Like if you say I'm a doctor, there's that old kind of like mystery about like, I don't know, like a son and his dad, like get in an accident and the dad dies and the son's rushed to the hospital. And then the doctor says, I can't operate on this son. You're supposed to guess why. And people are like, what? How could it be? Is it like, and it takes people, I don't think this is the case anymore, but at the time it would take people a while to realize, oh, it's the mother, right? So this kind of way in which that there's a kind of assumption there that the male subject is just sort of the generic subject, and that a lot of the attributes that we value about philosophers, rationality, linear, stoic, maybe, like all the things that might be considered valuable traits of a philosopher are actually just sort of idealizations of the male and then abstracted, if that makes sense. And so I think there was a time when that really spoke to me because I felt my difference a lot. Like I felt my difference in very overt sexism and very overt comments about, I was like an affirmative action admit, or, if I got heated, then I was being emotional, or, that I even had a professor once say, I don't think women are capable of doing this extremely abstract metaphysics. And I had been a chemical engineering student who got interested in philosophy. So it was, there was a lot of that. And I think it is possible now that it doesn't speak to people the same way, but I think that resonated with my experience at the time. And I kind of thought, yeah, there's no way for me to embody this role of philosopher or say other professions unless I sort of say I'm a female philosopher. And then the minute I say that, it diminishes my value in some ways.
I found myself wondering, while acknowledging that perspectivism that comes in, and sort of unearthing that out of, the history of philosophy and thinking about that problem, even if there's stated ambitions of universality or understanding all the metaphysics and the kinds of beings there are or all that kind, that it's infected with the context and the positions and the, biases involved by the people who are doing it. And that it's also work to recognize those and think about what it means for the work that you're doing and how much of it infects the work, the philosophy itself, or how much of it affects the activity of doing philosophy. So, for instance, it's perfectly possible that all the philosophy work that's being done is good, but the institution of higher learning is completely corrupt, right? Now it's probably not true that those two are completely opposite from one another, but it makes me wonder about the categorization of that difference as being the only or the primary difference in terms of the problem of identity and bias and how it infects our work. Or is it an example of one that there are practical things to deal with, but also there are philosophical things to deal with in terms of how you understand the world? It might affect your metaphysics, but not from the standpoint of necessarily having gender be a different axis or race be a different axis or, pick any other kind of thing like that. It made me wonder just about someone like Foucault would go the direction of, well, it's all about power. You abstract out from specific identities and have them be instances. And so, there's lots of ways this could play for Irigaray, right? It could be a practical point that's being made that informs changes she wants to make in the world. Or it could be the philosophical point that, yes, actually, things are metaphysically gendered in that way.
Let's stop for some sponsor messages, which, of course, you would not have to hear if you were using one of our ad-free feeds. Go to partiallyexaminedlife.com/support for details. Wellness isn't just about mindfulness, exercise, or the right skincare routine. It's so much bigger than that. Science, politics, social media, everything around us shapes our health. And every week on America Dissected, epidemiologists Dr. Abdul Al-Sayed and Dr. Caitlin Jetelina cut through the noise to tell you what you need to know to protect yourself and your community. New episodes of America Dissected drop every Thursday. Listen wherever you get your podcasts. I want to throw out another quote, page 207. So this is the second page of what we read. This aporia of discourse as to the female sex, whether it is envisaged as a limit of rationality itself, or as women's powerlessness to speak coherently, raises a question and even provokes a crisis, which may be analyzed in very specific areas, but which, in order to be interpreted, have to pass through the master discourse, the one that prescribes, in the last analysis, the organization of language, the one that lays down the law to others, including even the discourse held on the subjects of these others, the discourse on discourses, philosophical discourse, in order to interrogate its stranglehold on history, its historical domination. So this seems like it is calling for, right? It's a part of the mimesis is a genealogy that, that throughout this, I think we should be judging her prose by Nietzsche rules. And this might be a thing of oh, well, if a man can act all crazy ass in his style and you just say, what a genius. Well, when a woman does that, you're like, oh, this doesn't make any sense. No. And we just read,
or Heidegger rules.
Right. Well, exactly. What was the ethicist that we just read?
Korsgaard?
Yes. Christine Korsgaard, who is so clear about everything and is just really, there's nothing hand wavy. She's really, really trying to focus it. And maybe Irigaray does this in her other works. I don't know. In this, it is extremely hand wavy because it's just whether a limit of rationality itself or as women's powerlessness to speak coherently. So the second one is what you were talking about, Jenny, is like, yeah, people think that women can't be philosophers and that's stupid. But you could also see it, and this is, she even wants to play on this a little bit of like what you think of as rational step-by-step argumentation. There's something at least prototypically masculine about that, or a particular kind of masculine. Obviously, Nietzsche doesn't think that way. Obviously, lots of men don't think that way. But there's something that can be, if you're going to talk about that which is beyond, that is closer to religion, that is beyond what we can say. So what Lacan calls the real, right? So the symbolic order, this is Lacan being sprayed all over this. This is the phallic order, right? The name of the Father is the putting things in language. But what about all the experiences that we have, all the emotions that we have, everything that slips between language that the artist has to come along and present? And she's suggesting that, well, if women would do philosophy, you'd get a lot more of that. You'd get those views. You know, it's comparable to like, if women ran more governments, we wouldn't have all these wars. Well, if women ran these philosophy departments, we would have a more artistic, really more faithful to our experience and not as reductive type of philosophy.
So this is a great moment for me to point out, like one of the tasks I felt like I always had when I was working more on Irigaray was defending her from kind of what you're suggesting, that she's an essentialist, or also defending her from sort of reducing all the problems down to just understanding sexual difference as the fundamental difference, right? And I think this is why she has to adopt different writing styles, because she could write in a very clear, maybe not as precise as the person you're
Christine
referencing.
Korsgaard, yes.
Yeah. I mean, I know what you're talking about with that style, but she's capable of being intelligible and speaking to audiences that don't want to think about what chiasmus or envelope mean, right? Uh-huh. But when she's done that, then people, I think, can't understand that she's not, that she's trying to sort of reconstruct, to use Dewey's words, some of these terms. So when she's thinking about sexual difference, and I think there's been a lot of interesting work that shows that it doesn't just have to come down to her actually like affirming heterosexuality or affirming that there's only two sexes, but she's trying to come up with a different metaphysics, a different ontology. And this is the way she does it. And I think it's much more open to just in general, making a space for, to use another pragmatist term, pluralism, or the recognition that we are all blind to experiences of others, that there's certain shortcomings to our own points of view that we need to be aware of. But the problem is that when she goes into that more clear, intelligible speech, then it sounds like she's saying things like women essentially are anti-war, or women are essentially pro-nature, or women are essentially X.
And then you're like, oh, so you want Kristi Noem in charge? She's a woman.
I mean, if anything, like, I know that Seth liked the women on the market. I kind of figured he would, and I hope he says stuff about it, because there were moments in that piece where I think she actually does address the way that women like Kristi Noem are. I think she has more of a critique of the women that sort of inhabit the role of the femininity that is prized by a certain dominant patriarchy, or sort of a sort of certain, what has been the dominant style patriarchy, that they are used in a certain way to enhance, like to create value and relationships among men, right? So I don't know. I think that's always her problem. And I think that a lot of people have read her, and sometimes I think she's falls into it as sort of suggesting that there's this essential difference between men and women. But I like to think of it as her being a phenomenologist and just pointing out that we are embodied, we live in bodies, our bodies are medium to the world and others, and that a different body leads to profound differences maybe of how, what we see, how we see it, how we interpret it, Well,
yeah, when you go and emphasize that, then you have a metaphysics that emphasizes the individual instances as having their own being that isn't wholly derivative from the category or the species that they're a being of. And so it would be very natural to be, in addition to, going along the direction of saying, well, women aren't derivative beings as beings from men. And she points to the history of philosophy, and there's all kinds of other history in which that kind of argument is made that informs, power relations and social relations. In addition to, in that way, then a certain thread of philosophy becomes apologetics for a political structure, right? But if you go and say, well, okay, so women aren't, from following a metaphysical argument, we need to revise that. And, she called upon Hegel in this respect and so forth. You would go further. I think I like what you're saying about, from a pragmatic point of view, you would begin to emphasize the individual being is not wholly defined, wholly encompassed by their species or their, as instances, they have their own individual beingness. I
would just add, though, you just made me think about this. And I think in that, again, opening pages, she uses the term eidetic, right? And eidos. And I think that she does, however, want to say that there is sort of, let's say, like a shape or a model for male, but that allows for a diversity of experiences within that shape. But that you would need more than one shape. Like human beings we shouldn't be able to just say there's an eidos that we can collapse all of the sort of differences of human beings into. So,
Species
women don't really have like a set of images, a sort of imaginary that allows them to give themselves a sense of coherence or selfhood. And Lacanian terms, like the mirror stage, they don't have a way to insert themselves so that they can be subjects of discourse and participate in discourse, because they have to kind of find their way in a shape that is male, like the eidos male.
I'm just getting reminded about how, in talking about her rhetoric, her way of speaking, it's of course common for it to be very purposefully chosen amongst authors and philosophers. Some of them feel like their rhetoric is less purposeful and just sort of accidental. I feel like Kant's rhetoric is basically that's just the way he just worked, right? Nietzsche, I think Mark's right. Nietzsche has a very, very self-conscious mode of rhetoric. And my gut feeling is that Marx just talked the way he writes. Like he just yells at you all the time. And that's less self-consciously rhetorical. But I can just seeing the variety of ways of writing and speaking for Irigaray, that she clearly is very conscious of the context and the audience that she's speaking to. And my impression is that that's going to be intimately informed with both what she's trying to say and also what she's diagnosed as being the challenge of saying things. And that from, being a female philosopher, and that she's recognizing that in a way that I think if, you got her over a glass of wine, she'd be saying, of course I'm doing that, right? That there's no other way for me to interact, and I have to be more conscious of it than somebody like Kant, who would have just been speaking the way he just speaks.
Yeah. I think you're right.
You mentioned the mirror stage. There's some mirror imagery in this. And of course, the idea of the speculum is, but what she's arguing against, and this is maybe what Dylan was saying, I'm not sure I recognize myself as male or something like in this edifice that she's protesting. And again, this could be because it's the 70s, because I compared her rhetoric to Nietzsche because I think she is being overly sweeping and dramatic, even though she's saying things that sound more Heideggerian or Merleau-Ponty in terms of like, hey, we're in bodies. We're not truly spiritual beings. I mean, Nietzsche makes that kind of point as well, but that Nietzsche feels like he can say something in an overly simplistic way because he wants to give you a slogan. He wants to hit you over the head with something to make you think about it and not necessarily like be his own Walter Kaufman to interpret and translate it to nice language.
That's true.
Yeah, so I'm looking at 210. Relations among subjects always have recourse explicitly or more often implicitly to the flat mirror, that is, to what privileges the relation of man to his fellow man. A flat mirror has always subtended and traversed speculation. What effects of linear projection, of circular turning back onto the self as the same? What eruptions in signifying points of identity has it entailed? What subject has ever found in it finally its due? What other has been reduced to it by the hard to represent function of the negative, a function enveloped in that glass and also in its void of reflections, where the historical development of discourse has been projected and reassured? Or again, a function assigned to the role of matter, an opaque and silent matrix, a reserve for the specularizations to come, a pole of a certain opposition whose fetishist dues have still not all been paid. All right, that's probably, no, this is, every sentence you could spend quite a bit of time trying to figure out what this was. But I was trying to figure out what this flat mirror, she talks a lot in this about like being the philosopher's wife. Mm-hmm. And I, of course, think about my own tendency to like, yeah, everybody wants to talk and have other people to bounce ideas off other people. And so if that's what the woman is doing, is just being I'm a listening ear and I will bounce things back. And maybe she knew more about the Beauvoir-Sartre relationship that I don't know what exactly she's referring to in this, but I certainly can see ways. Yeah. So having if the normal thing is not the Hegelian subject to subject, but is just, I just want a mirror. I just want somebody to say back what I've been saying to them so I can know that I'm real. And that's like this man's craziness on this earth that is very isolating.
I see what you're saying, Mark, but I interpreted her, especially right from where you ended, to interpret the mayor's intervention to discover what it may have kept suspended in an unreflected blaze of its brilliance, what it may have congealed in its decisive cut, what may have frozen of the other flowing, and vice versa. Of course, this is what's at stake. I interpreted her as saying, okay, recognizing that we are seeing ourselves through a reflection and seeing our world through a reflection. She's pointing to that fact as being the mirror itself affecting the way in which we see ourselves in the world. And I think you might be right that there's that aspect too of just, well, women are just the mirror, the mirror, not mirror.
The tane of the mirror.
the mirror reflection. But I thought she was not indicting, but causing us to consider, I want to say the word reflect, consider the fact that we interpret the world through a mirror. So in some ways, embracing a Hegelian interpretation of ourselves and how we interact with each other and how we understand ourselves through an act of reflection, and needing and wanting to revise that analogy.
So to me, the mirror stuff was really important in my work. And I should have looked up the quotation, but there is a quotation from Virginia Woolf that is something like, women is the mirror that reflects men twice the size or something. And I think, specularization, speculum, speculate, she's playing on these terms. And I think another way to think about it, if the mirror thing doesn't always hit, is the ways in which woman or femininity they're often the metaphors that men have used to explain things they're doing. So the midwife, Socrates' midwife, or in a lot of sort of discussions of science as, I don't know,
looking up the skirt of nature,
plowing the fields, or I don't know. I can't think of all of them, but there's a lot of work that's been done. Actually, one of my other dissertation advisors, Eva Kate, wrote a really great paper on woman as metaphor, mostly coming out of the philosophy of linguistics. But she makes the same point in a way that's maybe more accessible than Irigaray. But the idea here is that for Irigaray, again, if you use a Jamesian view, there's more than we can grasp, right? The world is teeming and pulsating and full of changes, and each of us grasps a part of it. What she wants to say is that, like, sort of the Western philosophical tradition or Western culture has taken sort of an interpretation or a slice out of that and kind of perpetuated that. And then everything has been set up to keep mirroring that back, those assumptions back, when in fact the world's way more complicated than, way more and changing and pulsating and rearranging than we want. But when, say, male scientists or male philosophers have used metaphors that tend to take what is sort of the natural women's thing, like giving birth or nurturing or nourishing or being an envelope or a womb or a matrix, whatever matter, when those metaphors have been used to then explain a different domain that has never been described before, like what doing philosophy is or what doing science is, I think her point is that then there's no place for women to be part of that process of building a sort of new body of knowledge or a set of tools, because they're already being imported as non-subjects, as non-knowers into the explanation. Because, again, how do you describe something that's never been done before? You have to use metaphors, and metaphors use something that you know well to describe something that is kind of a novel domain to explain it. And so I think, she uses the mirror, or you could use metaphor. And I think that's the problem. And so she uses different writing strategies in order to kind of like point out the moments where things aren't said, kind of create moments that sort of shows there's a little bit sleight of hand going on here in the way this has been articulated.
So the improvement over the flat mirror is the curved mirror.
The curved mirror, the concave mirror, yeah.
Which as a speculum, nobody goes into gynecology because they want to look at themselves in the speculum. Like you could actually get an idea of what's going on inside and the surrounding, metaphorically, we want to look at the genealogy. We want to deconstruct the situation of thinking itself. We want to, see what all the presuppositions are going into the creation of this phenomenological subject or Cartesian subject, or, and the metaphysical implications of that, so that we can put things in perspective and not think that we're just reporting on the objective truth as we, the armchair phenomenologists, see it, but are understanding how, right, that jump from that ideal Husserlian view of phenomenology is we're all going to see the same phenomena. That's the objective essence of the world. No. When you get Heidegger and following people, how do many things about your background warp how you see the phenomena, so we, can move from phenomenology, which is really the only perspective that we have, is your own perspective wondering about stuff, to the idea of heterophenomenology and grasping that there are others, and that there are things that I'm missing, that there are things that I necessarily cannot see. It could be my class. It could be many things, that are determining what I report on as objective phenomena.
I struggled with what she was trying to do with the curved mirror, because I interpreted her as trying to say, well, the mirror would be curved in order to look back on ourselves in a different way than a mirror reflects back. This might be because I'm a physicist, but I'm like, that's not how a mirror works. and so I'm like, the curving of the mirror is going to lead to an image that's distorted in a different way than a current mirror is distorted, right? I mean, a regular flat mirror is distorted in specific ways, but it's definitely distorted in ways that are not, we're used to the distortion of right and left being flipped, and maybe depth, but the funhouse mirror that's curved, makes all the distances seem different. So you get the distorted, but what it doesn't do is it doesn't allow you to see the back of your head or something like that, or the inside, I found myself, it felt like the image it became much more, the curving became yet another layer of analogy.
Yeah, the metaphor, I think, ultimately fails, or let's not say fails. Let's say the metaphor ultimately reaches the end of its utility,
sure,
which I think is indicated. I'll just reference at the end of, I think it's the last essay we read. She just sort of makes a closing comment about presentation versus representation, where the masculine is presentation and the feminine is representation or representation. Or maybe, I'm sorry, she didn't say representation. She says reproduction, to bring it back to the biological metaphor. And ultimately her project of trying to find a way to make space for a true female subjectivity, the concave mirror is not going to do the trick.
Mm-hmm.
And that's maybe the difference. I'm not a scholar. Maybe this is early versus later kind of, maybe, but we probably shouldn't get too hung up on the mirror at this point, or we'll never make it to anything else in the second part.
Well, let's wrap up our first part. We've at least gotten a taste of the speculum. We've got it. I don't want to put those words together. And we'll talk much more about this. We'll get to this Women on the Market at the very least, and some bits of the other ones, which are more practical. And I think we've stumbled into the themes that are in the later essays already quite a bit here. So it's not like we're stuck on page 4 here, even though we're technically stuck on page 4. So if folks want to hear that immediately, go to partiallyexaminedlife.com/support, and you can sign up to be a member through our website, through Patreon, through Apple. and get that. Actually, Apple will still get you it next week. In any case, we'll see y'all in part 2. Bye.
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 Bye-bye.